All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest seminar for the U.S. Society of Ecological Economics. This continues our series of putting ecology into ecological economics. Last week we had a science talk, if you would, on forest ecosystems, and today we follow that up with a talk on forest economics. Our speaker is Jesse Henderson. He's a research economist at the USDA Forest Service in the Southern Research Station. And his talk is titled Forest Economics in the U.S. South, Market and Ecosystem Dynamics. And with that, I will say thank you, Jesse, very much. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, John. I'm going to share my screen real quick. All right, just everybody can see that, I assume.
Yes,
All right.
thank you.
So I wanted to start just by elaborating on my organization. Um, Many people may not know, but okay, so the U.S. Forest Service is part of the USDA, a small part, and then an even smaller part of the U.S. Forest Service. There's research stations, and I'm in the Southern Research Station. And then below that, there's the Forest Economics and Policy Unit, which I'm the project leader for. We have 6 scientists studying a variety of different topics. And these 3 bullet points here are uh, sort of the conceptual basis for what this Forest Economics and Policy Unit does. So I thought, you know, my conception of ecological economics is that I see it as a heterodox approach, and also um, there's an element of being a little bit more uh, meta-analytical, if you will, and think about how we conceive of things and how our perceptions. So this first one, human and natural disturbances, the old version of our uh, work unit description had just natural disturbances, but we sort of in our revision we're thinking, how can you separate the human and natural? Like a lot of times they feed back upon each other. um, there's like they're linked at every step of time. So uh, let's just put them together, and then we'll deal with the individual parts, as we do our research plans. And then we think about forest management in society. That's sort of a general uh, smaller scale types of projects. And then markets and trade, that could be any size. A market is many participants doing economic activity, and not just one person, say, like you might have in forest management, one person managing their forest land. And so trade is obviously global and international in scale. An important part of our research, that we're tested on and we're judged by our process. Universities, they have a tenure process. We have a different system, but we are judged by our impact in a different way. And part of that way is making science that's useful to stakeholders. So there's a little bit of a practical edge to what we do. And and so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my work today. Um, Most of it done with other people. So and it's sort of logically ordered here. I'm going to give a brief overview of this concept of forest landowner behavior. Basically, what are the objectives of people who own forest land? And then I'm going to get sort of on the edge of harvest behavior. And then I'm going to move on to some examples of forest sector model applications. I'll describe what that is. Essentially, a forest sector model is trying to describe how forests interact with their environment, which could include, how trees grow, how they respond to climate change, how they respond to disturbances, and then that is interfaced with human intervention. For example, a forest product harvest or other kinds of management activities. Okay, so I guess before recording started, John said that 30 people registered to come to this meeting today, but when I started, there were only 10. So that's stated objective was the registration, right? A revealed preference may be different. So um, right here, I want to just show you some results. This is national scale. Was part of my dissertation. There's a National Woodland Owner Survey, which takes place periodically, asking people who own forest land uh, what their objectives are for ownership. And on the x-axis, I take the log transform of their wooded acres, and then aggregate it to these discrete scales, just to simplify the issue. And then I'm looking at what the respondents said in terms of their management objective. And what we see on the left panel is that the smaller your wooded acres, the more you value uh, beauty or aesthetic value of forests, the more you value it as part of your home or for privacy or as a family, as a way to experience your family. And the larger, that starts to decline. And that kind of makes sense because, and you know, had a really large forest, how much of that can you actually see? How, how can you experience all that aesthetic value? Um, and then in the middle, we have things that are sort of not related to the size of someone's forest land. Um, Nature, water, wilderness, fire, and non-timber forest products. And then on the right side, we see things that are uh, positively correlated with the size of forest land. So that's investment. They're holding on to the property to uh, sell it for a higher amount later on. Cabin, that was a really small sample size. Not many people answer that question, but it's you're going to have a cabin on a more secluded, bigger forest. Farming, there's some farming. This survey asked about farm uses and forest use. So bigger property overall has bigger relationship with farming. Uh, Having the forest land for heirs, wanting to give it to their children. And then out of all of these management objectives, timber objective increases the most, has the highest positive correlation um, to size of wooded acres. Also, hunting and recreation are more related to wooded acres. So that's our segue to timber. How does the structure of the forest relate to timber? And these boundaries that humans put on their land, which defines how much land they own, property rights, uh, has an impact on uh, how the provision of these different objectives occurs across the landscape. All right, so this is a different Forest Service data set called Forest Inventory and Analysis Data. And this data is collected by uh, field crews going out measuring trees, different aspects. They have plots that are spaced, that are placed approximately every uh, 6,000 acres. You'll forgive me for not converting to hectares. Um, and this graph is just to show this same size of forest, size of wooded acres has positive correlations with different kinds of forest uh, harvesting. So let's say in Alabama, the higher the forest, the acreage that the plot was on, the more likely you'll see a clear cut. And the more likely you'll see a thinning. A thinning is, for those who aren't familiar, is when when people harvest some trees at a younger age to get smaller diameter trees. Um, and what that does is it increases the growth rate beyond that and also decreases competition between the remaining trees. All right, so now we're going to simplify or look at a different way of framing this. And this is ownership type. So the blue rectangles are it's owned by a corporation or an LLC or something. Yellow is not a corporation. It could be a family forest landowner or a uh, tribal owner or uh, some other uh, non-public ownership. And we see a similar type of thing with just this binary variable. We can see that um, more thinning tends to occur for corporate owners. More thinning occurs with clear-cut owners. And you think, what is the purpose of a corporation? It's, for profit taking, right? For making profit or protecting assets or even for investment. But um, this these sets of figures are showing that where we have economic incentives that are sort of the cards are shown by this corporate destination. All right, so now that's just a little bit of backdrop about forest landowner behavior, about harvest behavior, and how we can think about uh, separating different types of forests, landowners, and treating their behavior as different. Um, so I'm going to talk about forest sector modeling for essentially the remainder of my talk. Um, and this is a way to model the markets for forest products, but it's also a way to model the forests as well. And what we like to do is integrate the biology of forests and some economic principles. Because forests take a long time to grow, we typically run these models decades to, some forest sector models go centuries into the future. And I would say this type of modeling, in contrast to some other economic types of models, it's more of a systems dynamic approach, or you might say it falls into the coupled human natural systems way of thinking. Um, just think about it. You have trees that grow at a nonlinear pace over their lifespan, and you have compare that to an agriculture model where you have annual crops, right? There's a lot more uh, nonlinear behavior that you would observe. So we have to account for that. Um, and some of the questions we're going to look at is how does forest carbon change with human and natural disturbances? Um, so we have this model of a forest. We're extracting some wood from it, and we're looking at what the forest carbon consequences are. So the primary data source is the forest inventory analysis data. So we summarize all kinds of details about from these on-the-ground plot measurements, looking at the forest demographics, so the age structure. It takes a long time for forests to grow to an age where they will be considered a saw timber tree, for example. Um, and uh, we have to separate the ages of forests into different categories or buckets, if you will, in order to tease out what forest products are available at different times. So I was telling John earlier that my undergrad was in physics, so I'm still in this domain, thinking about space and time, and I'm trying to account for all of the nuance therein. And what you see in the map on the right is the groupings by the Forest Inventory Analysis Program they're called survey units. It's just a collection of counties that would have a representative sample uh, in order to have valid statistics on the biological data that we use for the model. And so, like the previous slide where I showed the corporate versus the not corporate ownership having different behaviors, we separate those owners in the model so that growth rates on corporate owned land are different than non-corporate owned land for various reasons. Uh, we have different forest types, and we have softwood and hardwood as broad collections of species, um, and more details in the next slide. So this is the economics 101 version of uh, uh, market equilibrium assumption, let's say. You have a supply curve and a demand curve. I like to call this the L and the X, the LX model. Um, you have a demand and a supply uh, that you calibrate to what the empirical data says is occurring, and then things can happen that change shift the supply curve or shift the demand curve. And what we typically do in forest economics is this classical model of uh, when the forest grows, um, there's more wood out there that lowers the cost of getting the wood. So it's different than a price effect. It is we call it an inventory effect or a growing stock volume effect. That by itself, if you grow the forest, you're going to shift the supply curve to the right. And what that does is it lowers prices. And then if you, let's say, uh, International Paper or Georgia Pacific has a new mill that comes into the forest product mill that comes into the area, that's different than the price effect. That's a change in the demand. That's a shift of the demand curve. So we have things like this, these kinds of shifts happening within the model and sometimes within scenarios that we run into the model uh, to capture the various changes over time. And just a little note about how the scope of the model. Um, this version of the model doesn't include public land or anything other than developed land, agriculture, and private forests. In the U.S. South, many main uh, you should know that most of the forest land is owned by private landowners. Uh, this is different than other areas so in some parts of the Western US, there's a lot of federal land. In Europe, there's a lot of state-owned or public forest land. And actually, in much of the world, there's a lot of public forest land. But something that makes the South unique is this high concentration of uh, private forest landowners. Also, that's the case in the Northeast as well, in the North and the Northeast. So you have private decision makers, doing what they want with their own land. And among this, within this private forest category, we have upland hardwood, bottomland hardwood, mixed pine and hardwood, natural pine, which is pine that's been naturally regenerated, pine plantation, which is pine that has been planted. And each of these categories has different growth rates, different baseline uh, amounts of volume, and so forth. And another thing, I mentioned systems dynamics. This is another part of the system. Uh, so here I'm showing a little schematic from Microsoft Paint with a growth curve of a forest over time. And then here a thinning occurs, so you get some pulpwood from that thinning. And then subsequently, the forest continues to grow. And then when you do a clear cut harvest, you get some saw timber and you get some pulpwood. And so the saw timber goes to a sawmill. They produce lumber. and there's a little bit of residual pulpwood left from that. So they cut it, there's some residue from that production process. And a lot of times those residues are recycled. Sometimes they use it for uh, energy at the sawmill, or sometimes they sell it to a pulp mill or a pellet mill. Pellets are, in this case, is wood pellets, which are condensed uh, pieces of wood that are burned for bioenergy. So I'm going to get to 4 examples of using this forest sector model, which I've described in the previous slides. One is going to be about carbon fertilization, and one's a land use change. Third one is about hurricanes. And the fourth is not a forest sector model paper, but it's related. It's about how productive are pine forests in the South. So this is from a paper. Obviously, the GIF wasn't published in the paper because you can't do that. But I this is a publication in Ecological Economics Journal, um, where I was trying to look at the effects of carbon fertilization on forests, uh, and 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 then that effect on forest markets. So uh, the direction of causality here is we have exogenous climate change, um, and it's changing the way the forests grow over time, and that will change the prices in timber markets. And what you see here, these plots by survey unit, which are collections of counties, is a simulation based on the 3PG model, which is an ecological process model. It sort of takes in lots of physics. I'm not going to get into the details, but it's in the paper cited here. But it takes into account uh, nitrogen and all these physical processes, and um, that varies by location. But in general, what you see is if you change the planting year, then you change the productivity of the pine forest. That was the thing that was incorporated within the forest sector model. Okay, so I'm skipping straight to the forest carbon results from that paper. And what I will first describe this chart. It's total forest carbon in the South for pine forests only. And all of these wispy solid lines are various climate model projections. And the dashed line is without climate change, without carbon fertilization, um, adding productivity or growth to the forest. And I ran different scenarios, and this is uh, the way to think about this is it's stacked levels of complexity, or simplicity to simple to most complex. So there's a constant harvest case. What if we just keep harvesting the amount that we're harvesting now? No increase in demand. Let's pretend that, you know, populations are increasing, but more homes don't need to be built, right? To accommodate that. Well, in that case, you get, you know, first of all, the baseline is no climate change or no carbon fertilization. And the alternative case is with carbon fertilization. So if you look at all 4 scenarios, first of all, you see in every case, carbon fertilization is adding forest carbon uh, from this exogenous source, no matter what you assume about how markets function or work. So we know that. Um, so then what if you add more complexity to the way you think about how markets interact with the forest? Um, let's assume that more people means you need more wood. We're going to have this harvest exogenous case, which describes that. Let me go back, sorry. Uh, which is uh, more people in, demanding more wood, So you're taking more out of the forest. And so in this case, um, you are, this is a pretty substantial demand scenario. And you're not allowing forests area to change in this scenario. Okay. Um, Third scenario, the blue one, is what if you take that last scenario, but you allow increasing prices to encourage people to plant more forests? And so you get the blue scenario. And the fourth scenario is, okay, what if you allow, uh, what if you have a demand curve that is nonlinear, and if people demand more wood, they may not necessarily get it all because of a price effect. And that's the green line. So what we see is you have this sort of back and forth that eventually sort of gets adapted away, if you will, by the most complex scenario. The one that has the most adaptation sort of uh, levels it out. Okay. So two takeaways. Um, the carbon fertilization is going to add more forest carbon, regardless of what you think about how I'm modeling markets. Um, and and second, if you have adaptive prices, um, it's an equilibrating force in the system. And just to show what this looks like for, um, I don't have my legend here, unfortunately. I can figure it out. This is the green line is growing stock in the case of the demand exogenous case, the screen case. The blue is removals. So this is the demand that I'm trying to pull away from. And these are all indexed to 100, so it's not to scale. Approximately, the removals are about 2% of growing stock uh, based on data. And then prices here. So what you see here is prices kind of being level or even declining over time. Um, so we're not seeing a lot of price change in this demand scenario that would encourage people to try to be profit seeking and plant more forests in order to sell wood at higher prices in the future. So this analysis leads to another question, which is how do we deal with land use change? Uh, we saw here that, okay, land use change, if you just add land use change to the simple harvest scenario, then you get a big effect. So land use change must matter. So what I did is I estimated a land use change model in a subsequent paper published in Forest Policy and Economics. It's a land share model, and the Cliff Notes version is uh, there's a pine plantation rent variable, which is based on pine prices in the South. And if you have higher prices, it leads to higher rents, and that leads to a greater share of pine plantations among the forest types and among agriculture. And what you don't see here is developed land. It's just a quirk of this model is you have one of your land shares in the denominator here. It's sort of hidden away, but um, but what you can infer from these negative signs on population and per capita income is a negative relationship with all of these land uses means you get more developed land with higher population and higher per capita income. That's a result that's found in many other models, so makes sense. So this is a new land use model that I'm plugging into the forest sector model that was used in the previous paper. And we're going to see what this new, better empirical land use model tells us about the trade-offs between pine prices and forests and other land uses. And when you're projecting into the future, uh, one reason that land use change model is kind of simple, just three variables, is because you need data for the future to plug into any kind of model that you create. I mean, you could probably create a better land use change model with lots of variables and complicated, and you could describe the past very well. But then you wouldn't have the variables to plug into that model to make projections. So I took downscaled estimates, population income per capita developed by two colleagues of the Forest Service, and those SSPs or social shared socioeconomic pathways you may have seen in other literature are used to project forward. I'm just using the middle of the road for this one. And then we have different combinations of pine, pulpwood, which is small trees, pine, saw timber, large trees. We have low demand for both. We have low and high, high and low, high and low. And those high scenarios are really ramping up quickly by 2030 and then sort of moving along at the per capita rates, and low demand scenarios uh, are kind of are about half of the high scenarios by 2030. Um, and in the next set of graphs, there's going to be a lot of legend action, but I'm going to try to simplify it for you. Okay. Uh, what you should pay attention to is just the colors to interpret these graphs. The beta here is the land use change model parameter that was estimated. The plus sigma is just one standard deviation. The minus sigma is minus one standard deviation. So you plug these. So okay, it's just sensitivity analysis. What if I'm wrong on my parameter by a standard deviation somehow? And what would the impact be if it was slightly different? In these high and low different combinations of demand, you still have growing stock or the volume of forest going up over time in both pine pulpwood and pine saw timber. But you see a divergence, you see nuances over time. So uh, uh, let's talk about what these are. So pine saw timber, the high case is where the H is second. So blue and green are the high cases for saw timber. So you see growing stock being lower in the short run and then getting higher in the long run. You see removals high, and there's slight differences between them because of uh, little changes that accumulate over time. And prices, you see that prices going up and then coming back down and then going up. And that's related to the biological, the growth variable that's changing, fluctuating slowly over time. You have these oscillations. And then if you have um, high pulpwood, high sawtimber demand and low pulpwood demand, the pulpwood removals get shoved back down even more, and the prices go down even more because some of that uh, pulpwood from the sawtimber harvest gets recycled back into pulpwood. Um, so the big picture is that higher demand creates these higher prices in general, but there's fluctuations over time, so that changes the incentive for people to plant these pine plantations. So what does this look like for forest area? So take all the land shares, and you portion them out, and you run the land use change model based on the pine prices and the exogenous population and income. And what you see is, pretty significant increases in, this is indexed to 100, increases in pine plantation area. Um, and you see decreases in natural pine under all scenarios, but more in the scenarios with higher pine prices. The black line is the baseline, so it's the low scenario. And you see similar kinds of changes in the other forest types, mixed pine and hardwood, and the upland hardwood. Bottomland hardwood is kept constant in this case. And but overall, for all forests, you see higher forest area, which means that on the margin, the land share model is saying that pine plantations will make a little bit of inroads into perhaps agriculture and uh, marginal agricultural land. Um, so this is area. Let's look at carbon. So forest carbon, you see this big boost. If you're only looking at pine plantations, you say, okay, it's a good thing, right? But you are losing carbon on natural pine and losing carbon in the other forest types. And but overall, if you add it all together, um, the high demand scenarios look pretty good in the long run. And what I'm going to do in the next slide is zoom in to that total forest carbon area, carbon indexed to the low baseline. In this case, you know, let's recall from the previous graph that everything's increasing. Carbon's going up in total. And what I have here is an actual baseline where I'm at each point in time, I'm looking at the relative index to the low scenario. And what we see is in the short term, which is a time frame that many people look at, uh, we have a higher demand, no question about it. It leads to lower forest carbon. But in the long run, you have this rebounding effect from a combination of growth and a combination of more planting that's occurring due to the high prices, and it goes up and beyond to like 2% higher in the 2.5% in this low pulpwood high saw timber case. But then it cycles back down. So you have these dynamics that are complicated. And the question this brings up is, well, what if I stopped looking at 2050? What if I cut my model off right here? I could totally make the argument that low pulpwood demand and higher saw timber demand uh, leads to higher forest carbon in the long run, but it cycles back down. And uh, these kinds of feedbacks and this dependency on when you stop your clock is some of the nuance that needs to be in the discussions about impacts of forest products on carbon. Okay, so I basically said all this already, but this last point about the projection period length influencing the forest carbon outcome conclusions is something that I think is important because this question about baselines has been debated back and forth in literature for a decade. Like, how do you make your baseline? What's your baseline case? What's the baseline going to be? But also, you have a timeline. Uh, you know, so how long are you going to go into the future? How are you going to account for the future versus the present? Is there any discounting that's going to be involved in your calculations? So uh, basically, the last few slides were about humans demanding more wood and what are the forest carbon gains. What if nature demands more wood? What if there's a hurricane that comes through and wipes out a bunch of forest? How do we deal with that? Um, what are the consequences for the forest product markets? What are the consequences for ecosystems? Um, Here's another paper that looked at this in the case of Hurricane Michael, which hit the panhandle of Florida in 2018. And color coded here are different collections of counties based on severity of damage. Um, uh, and and to the right is a sort of supply and demand schematic. I'll go through it really quickly, so as not to suck away all the time. But let's say you start at A as your supply and demand. Hurricane occurs, so it knocks back the available forest, and that shifts the supply curve to the left. Demand for that standing wood goes down because they can pick up the salvage wood off the ground. This is just the supply demand for standing green wood. And then the next year, let's say the forest grows, so the supply curve shifts to the right, and you end up at C. Well, if the hurricane had not happened and you grow from this point, you end up at D. So you have lower prices in the case of no hurricane and higher prices in the case of a hurricane. And this is sort of a conceptual model, but it's been shown statistically with other studies. And this is the sort of dynamic that I incorporated in this modeling. Um, and again, I'm going to, we're at 12:43 right now. I'm going to uh, give a very broad overview here. Uh, the answer is, can markets help forest carbon recover after a hurricane? Not within the 40-year time period we discovered that we studied here. So here's growing stock. This is proportional to forest carbon, and you get this big drop in the area, and then it sort of it sort of gets close to where it would have been without a hurricane 40 years later for pine pulpwood. That is when the trees grow, first thing that's available is pine pulpwood because it takes 15 years or so to get there. And then chip and saw is sort of between these two products in size, and uh, you eventually get there for that one. But saw timber doesn't quite get to the counterfactual no hurricane case. So how are we ever going to get this carbon back? That uh, you knock the trees down, uh, and if you leave it there, it's going to be emitted to the carbon, emitted to the atmosphere due to uh, fungi and so forth coming in and eating it all. But uh, what we found as well is that these higher prices, um, because of the system we have set up, prices don't really get back to normal either for pine saw timber. Um, but when we look at forest carbon, uh, which there's a plot of this of forest carbon in the paper, I believe, or there's a table that I did include here. Um, uh, what these scenarios in this paper were is different replanting scenarios, and uh, even under the 100% replanting, we can't recover that carbon uh, at least within 40 years. Which, in the conclusion of this paper, it's uh, essentially that in order to get there, you would need even more replanting uh, to recover the forest carbon. So more than 100% of the area has to be replanted. All right, well, what if we plant pine? Well, This is a paper published this year in Forest Ecology and Management, looking at the productivity of pine over time and based on different kinds of management. Um, and the big picture here is using the FIA data, which is what is used in the model we talked about previously in these applications. If you have natural pine, um, it is has been increasing in productivity over time. Like no human intervention, just the earlier you established it, the less productive it was. Okay, planted pine, based on the FIA data, more productive. Uh, and planted, typically, probably it comes with other management activities like silvicultural activities that would enhance productivity. Uh, for example, thinning or some of these other things that you see here, like fertilization, may have occurred on some of these, but on average, we see this shift up in productivity for pine that's planted. Uh, and then this second set of data here is sort of the top edge of the industrial planted pine area. So this is incredibly intensively managed compared to this natural pine. And also included within this this category of industrial is probably some signal from genetic, um, some better genetics in the pine seedlings. So just like farmers breed better tomatoes through sort of Mendelian genetics types of activities, people have been doing it for trees. And these people who in this category are the ones planting most of those pine trees. So you see a huge gain in productivity as measured by dominant height at age 25. And so this helps us know where the edge is for productivity for pine. And just running a machine learning model, random forest, conveniently named for this study. Establishment year is the biggest impact. Management type in this FIA data set is probably second place in feature importance. And establishment year, what could that be? Well, uh, as we looked at in the carbon fertilization study, that could be part of the story here is carbon fertilization, um, temperature effects, other kinds of uh, biological exogenous effects that are occurring over time. So our next steps for this are to sort of create a map across the southern US of, you know, what's the maximum amount of productivity that could be gained from in different areas. Um, if you add management to a pixel of land, let's say, or a plot of land, um, would you gain in carbon or carbon sequestration, or would you increase um, uh, the sequestration potential on a life cycle analysis basis? And so another part of that's the production possibilities frontier, but is it economically feasible? A lot of that NWS survey I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, a lot of landowners don't have the income or the ability to pay for forest management activities. So being able to produce timber or to sell carbon credits if there's a viable carbon credit market are ways that they can help finance some of these activities which are shown to increase productivity. So the big picture here is uh, that I would like everybody to walk away from this talk is that carbon stored in forests is both dynamic and non-linear. There's these feedback effects that are very interesting between markets and natural disasters uh, and then climate forcings that are all working together to create what we see. And then also part of my process in my modeling is to think about um, to take information that I have and then uh, you know, you're always updating the information. Just like the model's recursive dynamic, it's always uh, the next period is based on the last period's results. Um, Same thing should be true for our modeling. We should be recursive and always be improving and finding flaws and making advancements. And the other thing that's important for this work is that the choices about how we aggregate data can have important impacts. Um, just as one example, this figure here, um, in this FIA planted category, we're aggregating, we may be capturing some of these industrial people, but not enough to understand just how much more productive they are. And the same can be said, like if we had uh, lumped together our corporate landowners and our non-corporate or family forest landowners in our model, then we wouldn't capture those differences in their growth rates. We wouldn't capture the differences in their harvest behavior. So uh, at the same time, it's important to know when to stop disaggregating because of sample size and other considerations. And that will be it for my talk. I'll take any questions.
Thank you. There we go. Got the video going. So thank you, Jesse. That was very interesting. There's several questions already in the chat box, so we'll give each of those people an opportunity to ask their question. Eric, you have a question like what I was thinking, so go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Really appreciated your talk, Jesse. That was really interesting. So last week we had a forest ecologist talk about forest regeneration and some of the challenges associated with that. And you, the last, I posted the question in the chat just before you started talking about natural versus regeneration and the planted forests. So can you just explore that a little bit more,
Yeah.
real quickly about how does carbon fertilization affect regeneration, especially in like a more biodiverse natural forest?
Okay. So, I in my modeling and in that last pine productivity paper that I showed, there didn't seem to be uh, the time trend of establishment year affecting productivity. There didn't seem to be a difference between natural and planted pine. So I think natural pine stands are still they're able to benefit from this carbon fertilization. And basically, the way that works is, think of a young human child who is given the appropriate vitamins at the right time in their life, and they're able to prosper and grow in the way that the best way that they can. Same is true for trees, right? So if you if they're exposed to this carbon fertilization effect while they're young, then that's what contributes most to the growth. So starting over from let's say either a disturbed, hurricane disturbed uh, a piece of land or a human disturbed whatever, starting over gets them that growth boost. It's still going to take a long time to get the carbon back, but there is that sort of silver lining, I guess.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, let
Uh,
me look at some of the other questions here.
Tom, go ahead, ask your question.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thanks for the presentation. I live in the Central Virginia in the Piedmont region, where most of our open spaces are under forest cover. Uh, However, with a lot of population growth recently, one of the things that's gone on is real estate parcel sizes
Yeah.
have shrunk. In part, people build houses out in the country, and even if they have 20 acres or something like that, what we're seeing is the average parcel size that's under forest cover in our open spaces has been getting smaller and smaller, with some big exceptions. But I've heard from foresters that a lot of the parcel sizes that are under forest cover are too small for economical
Yeah.
timber cutting because of moving equipment and so on. And I know there's been a lot of population growth in the southeast, and I'm just wondering whether reduced parcel size is this kind of hidden issue that's affecting economic prospects for forestry in the southeast.
That is a great question, and one that I think about. I think you know, some work has been done on this parcel size question, but I don't think it's been quite definitive. And I actually have some in process work on this. And yeah, it's absolutely true. Like just from a practical perspective, loggers are more likely to work on larger parcels. Just, getting the equipment in there, it's just think of a returns to scale type of uh, uh, thing going on. So, and you saw like in my first slide, I think, how the parcel size can affect the values that people have. Part of that, oh, I have a small parcel. I'm not interested in timber. It could be because they know it's not possible. And so like does the wand choose the wizard or the wizard choose the wand? It may go both ways. Um, the Yeah, I would just say like one study I'm aware of could not find the effect
Hmm.
of parcel size. But I've done some digging of like looking at like parcel maps in North Carolina, for example. They have an open source parcel map and looking at a change in forest cover. And for smaller parcels, sometimes harvests occur across parcel boundaries. And I found little anecdotal cases of, oh, they all have the same last name. They must be like brothers and sisters who inherited their property and split it, and then they cooperated. So actually, there's a set of survey questions that we got approved through OMB, looking at cross-boundary cooperation, and that's something that some colleagues and I are working on is trying to see how do people cooperate with the neighbors uh, and not just timber harvest, but also conservation and promoting uh, healthy forests.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Next is Kylie.
Hi. I think you already answered the first part of my question because you were saying it near the end. Um, it was just basically a question about carbon credits and what your viewpoint around that would be and how that would affect the price and demand. I
Yeah.
also wanted to ask you too about in looking at the land use decisions, did you see anything around land trusts? And if so, what your thoughts were around that?
So with I'll answer the land use thing first. Um, the only thing that would be detectable in my land use model for land trust would be like just an average effect. So it wouldn't be able to like uh, you know you could increase in land trust is not a possibility in the model. So that would be sort of a structural change with it, that would have to be modeled separately. New model would be needed. Um, and then carbon credits, the last paper that I talked about was supported by funding from a congressional directive, which um, the the congressional directive was basically part of a law that said we want research for this topic, and the topic was how can we create income opportunities for forest landowners based on voluntary carbon markets. And so there's been a few maybe false starts on the voluntary carbon market credit, a lot of mistrust about the calculations, or like maybe are are they are they actually having an effect? There's been other cases like maybe California and elsewhere where people found holes in the methodology, um, and there's been some high profile newspaper articles saying that, oh, it doesn't work, it's a waste of time. Um, but there are, uh, you know, I think it's certainly feasible with the right kind of methodology. And another point is that they don't have to be like, if you had a system for carbon uh, carbon credits or something, you would have to be right on average. Like you could have some wrong, some cases that failed, or like maybe a natural disaster happened that you didn't foresee it, so there's going to be errors. But as long as they're right on average, um, then uh, then it's okay. On the other hand, uh, a a lot of the programs have been based on the likelihood of harvesting, uh, and anybody can just pretend that they were going to harvest and get that credit, right? So, you, I mean, the criteria would have to be like pretty good on determining likelihood. But this productivity mapping uh, that we're on the way to doing based on that pine productivity thing, uh, it wouldn't have to involve harvesting, because you could just say, okay, well, I can fertilize a little bit on this piece of land, and I'm going to get X amount of growth over a baseline, and even the NOx emissions are not going to, it's going to be better. You're going to the fertilizer emissions, associated emissions, life cycle emissions are going to be much smaller than the carbon we're going to store in the trees, and you got to do that kind of analysis, I think. But uh, it doesn't just have to be this uh, delaying harvest thing that was recently sort of fizzled.
Are there any other questions or comments? All right, we are basically out of time, so that's good. I'll just remind everybody, our next seminar will be January 10th by Daryl Burden, talking about marine habitats and economic values. Jesse, do you have any last comments that you'd like to make?
I just, thanks everyone for attending the talk on a holiday eve. And feel free to contact me if um, uh, you have any additional questions.
Thank you very much for a very informative and interesting seminar, and it really tied in last week's seminar on the science aspect of forestry. And we thank you very much for your time and doing this for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a nice holidays, everybody.